Welcome to Pier-Glass Poetry Panels. I'm Stan Galloway, your host. Today's panel is entitled Diction in Poetry, and we'll be hearing from poets from both sides of the equator. If you are joining us live, we ask you not to use the chat function, but instead send your questions and comments through the Q&A box at our website, pierglass.wixsite.com/mysite. We'll take a look at those toward the end of the show, but now let's get started and meet our first poet. Tami Haaland has been the Poet Laureate of Montana and a professor of creative writing. She is currently interim dean of liberal arts and social sciences at Montana State University, Billings. She is the author of 3 poetry collections, most recently, What Does Not Return. She has received numerous awards, and her work has been featured on The Slowdown, The Writer's Almanac, Verse Daily, American Life in Poetry, and in the Elemental Dialogue series by UK filmmaker Anna Cady. We're happy to have you here, Tami.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
As a writer and professor, what are some of the ways that you find important about the way we use words?
Well, all kinds of things. I mean, one of the things it's hard for me to separate out these various aspects of words. So I wrote a little bit about that, and I think I'm just going to begin with that before getting into the poems that I contributed to this presentation. So for me, diction is it's one instrument in this sort of orchestration that goes on. So think orchestra, and like diction would be the clarinet. But if you take just the clarinet by itself, it's not the full span of what's possible. In reality, it exists in relation to all of these other elements. So for example, I don't choose words separate from considerations of syllable count, sound, rhythm, the image the word conjures. All of those are so important. The denotation, the connotations, all of those things. Who speaks the word and what tone they use also affect the nature of a given word. Or another way to think about that is what tone and attitude will a particular word convey in the voice of a speaker. In terms of sound, it's not only alliteration or that chiming of consonants, but it's also the vowels and how those vowel sounds echo through a piece. Luckily, much of the selection happens in less conscious ways as words propel themselves along in a rough draft. A phenomenon that many, if not most, poets are familiar with. This kind of flow of language comes with practice and a willingness to trust the process, which in this early phase of drafting is somewhat beyond our conscious control. At least that's my experience of it. I'm not sure all poets write that way, but for me, it's like I pick up a thread and I run with it in that first draft. But after that, after the first words come to the page at sufficient speed to create a draft, the thinking becomes more conscious, though it's still intimately involved with all of those elements like sound and image and so forth. So I would argue that the writer develops something akin to muscle memory, as is the case with many other tasks. When we shovel or plant or run or bicycle, we don't consider the individual steps in the process or how to steer the bicycle around obstacles or maintain balance. We just engage and often let our minds wander while the work is happening. So in the initial phases of a poem, diction arrives in a similar way in the process of telling a story or describing, or perhaps better, hearing a word and setting pen to paper to see where it will lead. And we don't necessarily know where that is, that it's going. And then, after the drafting, it may become obvious in reading through the first result that some clunkers have arrived, and we can tell by their sound, their awkwardness, their lack of precision, the way they make a line go flat, like silly putty dissolving into a carpet. And we have work to do. And then it's time to consider what other words might fit better into the poem and serve its needs, and then what words can go by the wayside and disappear. So I will have to say that often, and I'll talk about this a little bit in these poems, often what happens for me is that the first draft will come, and then it might take me a year to figure out how to resolve the last line, how to get the sounds right, and it always just floats around in the back of my mind, looking for the right word. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'll get my poems up on the page here. Let me make sure I get the right one. So that's my last poem. Get back to the top. I'm just going to read this, but then I'm going to isolate a few lines or kinds of patterns just to illustrate some of what I've already said. The first two poems come from my book, What Does Not Return, and it deals heavily with dementia. She was so tiny. She was so tiny, I would give her anything. Sweets, cinnamon or lemon, thick puddings, strawberries. I would give her my arm, a smile, kisses on the forehead, my rocking frame beside her. I said it was okay, wasn't it? I said I loved her and rubbed her bony back, her swollen feet. We would play with lipstick and lotions. Your dry skin, I'd say. Her hair, the brush, the silly way they would braid her into a girl, but I wanted her hair long and loose, waves spilling down her neck. Her sunken eyes, her warnings, go now. Her greetings, you're finally here. It was a long while and it was yesterday. It was a year and a mile, a daily escape, a treat, a burden, a weight. We walked to the exotic swans and watched them preen. We compared shoes and traded clothes. We had sunlight. We had the gorgeous single red poppy in weeds. We had a back fence we couldn't climb, unplanted flower beds, cigarette butts healed into sidewalks. What a place. We were somebody's sister or another's enemy. Sometimes they hadn't seen us for years, and we watched them make bright forests on paper, using glitter to imitate the sky. I will have to say it's a little strange analyzing the diction in my own poems, but I have a few comments about this, and I think there's probably much more I could say, which I won't. I'll just keep going. But there's, I think, some obvious alliterations, sweets, cinnamon, strawberries, and it kind of continues on, skin. Those sounds come up quite a bit. But the vowel sounds probably mattered more to me when I was writing and revising this. The short I, the long E, the short E, these things that I think of as more buoyant as vowel sounds, as opposed to, for example, down or hung or, sounds that are just sort of heavier. And that buoyant kind of vowel sound was important to me because when you're caretaking and somebody has what is essentially a terminal illness, this dementia and this gradual decline, it's really important to keep things as positive as possible, to celebrate what is uplifting, to keep things sort of happy as you're moving along. And I recognize also that's ironic, as in, for example, Thomas Hardy's poem During Wind and Rain, where he's really talking about death and decay, but he's keeping the vowel sounds in at least several lines of each stanza very kind of upbeat. And then, so I think that happens through the poem, and that it's pretty obvious and traceable. These lines, the first three lines of the second stanza, I think something else is happening. I remember playing with these lines a lot, trying to get them right. There's quite a lot of concision, trying to show what it's like to be inside one of these assisted living dementia centers. But in the first two lines, the sound of the words, there are a lot of L's, yesterday, year. These are sounds that don't end quickly, right? They continue on. There's no finality in them. That it just strikes me right now. It's kind of stylized, a long while, and it was yesterday, a year, and a mile. But then it picks up speed as it moves into this third line: a treat, a burden, a weight. Again, I chose those sounds, particularly treat and weight, for that ending T, that alliteration. And while the vowel sounds still maintain a sort of lightness, they don't get too dark. Burden does, but the other two don't. This acceleration also, and the finality of those sounds kind of corresponds to what happens in this larger situation of dementia and things not ever getting better. I also think there's some irony. I'm piling up lots of details, the gorgeous single red poppy, but also the cigarette butts healed into sidewalks. And then sister and enemy are opposites in some sense, also maintaining a lot of the sound quality of the rest of the poem. Probably the line I struggled with most in this poem was the final one. I think I probably had all kinds of iterations of that line, and I recall that I was probably working with words like color and blue initially that don't correspond all that well to the predominant sounds in the poem. So finally then I landed on glitter to imitate the sky. This was a particular moment they were having in that center at the time, where they were all doing some craft project. But there's a sense of that falseness about it. As if, the next two poems are very short, and I just want to point out a few things about them I don't want to go over in terms of time. As if she needed to wrangle words into a semblance, as if sustenance were a simple matter, a sandwich day after day and nothing else. As if it were enough and logic would not erode. As if she could still manage once time had disappeared and space was sought into impossible puzzles. Those aren't my fingers, she might say, of the writing hand turned in upon itself. This one I think also is quite stylized, wrangling words. I guess that has a bit of that Western flavor, but it's also something about the difficulty of finding the right word. And semblance is something that has the outward appearance of a particular thing or the form of it, but is perhaps not so authentic or not really the thing in question. So I thought there was, as I look back on it, as I analyze it, I see there's a connection between that particular word choice, semblance, and this hand that that my mother could talk about but didn't recognize as her own anymore. So I don't know how conscious I was. These words seemed right. And again, I think I was propelled by sound, semblance, sustenance, simple matters, sandwich. The alliteration sort of carried me there, but then it fit. Those were the right words for this particular situation in the poem. And the other thing I want to point out in this one is the fourth stanza, that for the person with dementia, time and space are altered. memory, of course, associated with time, begins to disappear, but physical space changes for them as well. So a threshold in a doorway, for example, looks like an impossible space to cross over, but also that the constituent elements of the life don't dissolve so much, but they it's like they break apart, like jigsaw puzzles will break apart, but then you can't figure out how to put them back together. It's the connection that's missing. And then finally, I just want to say a few words about this poem. This is a newer poem that just appeared in an anthology and circulated on Facebook just a few days ago, called The Practice of Trees. The yard would like to become a forest, seedlings thick as grass. For a long time I mowed and pulled, but they have no regard for lawn and no limit. Ponderosa, spruce, linden, lilac, maple, cherry, oak. A tricky lot, they shoot up in secret and dig deep. Why not let them win? Never mind neighbors who keep weeds from cracks in sidewalks and square-edge their lawns. These stems have already hardened into bark. Now, if I trim a branch, I feel pain in the severed limb. Mostly, I listen. When I ask what the tree wants, the answer comes back. Love us. Should have been trees want. So the few things I want to point out in this one, again, you've already recognized I'm working with alliteration. I'm working with the echo of vowel sounds. The little list of trees in stanza 1, I played with that a lot. I had rowan trees at one point. Or mountain ash, we're dealing with then 3 syllables, 2 syllables. And since I already had ponderosa, I traded that in for spruce. There are some ways I could reorder those words and they wouldn't work very well. I thought it ended well with oak, provided a bit of finality for that list. And then mostly I want to talk about the last 2 lines. Originally, what I had, when I ask what the trees want, the answer comes back, love us or leave. And that's a whole different story. I gave that to a friend, the fiction writer Mark Sprague, if you happen to know his work. And he said, nah, you have to cut out those last 2 words. And he was right. It was an entirely different tone. It was a bit threatening. It was like the trees were saying, "Move out. We're taking over," which is not, credible, but also just not really the spirit of this poem. So I backed off and I put "love us" down in that last line. And then the other thing that I think may have what was a significant choice was that I used severed limb, which we also use in relation to humans. And so that closes the gap between the humans and the trees, if we're prone to feel that we are more separate from them. So at that point, I will just stop sharing. And I just want to say that this is a practice that we engage in, this work with language, and things that contribute to it are reading, our language study, translating, investigating etymologies. All of these things help us choose our words. Thank you.
Thank you, Tami. That was an excellent introduction to what words do when we're not watching, because I do recognize so much of the writing practice is unconscious, or at least not purposeful, until we make it so. And that's part of what I thought today would be, is a day that we look at purposeful choices that we make in our writing. So thank you again very much for that. After stints as an educationalist and an anti-apartheid activist in Botswana, Namibia, and Johannesburg, Kelwyn Sole was employed by the University of Cape Town for 30 years, retiring as De Beers Professor of Language and Literature. He has published 7 volumes of poetry, numerous articles on post-colonial and South African literature, as well as editing a collection of contemporary South African poetry for The Common in 2012. He has won numerous awards for his writing, including the Olive Schreiner Prize for his first collection, The Blood of Our Silence, and the South African Literary Award for Poetry for his most recent, titled Walking, Falling. Kelwyn, we're happy to have you join us today.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for having me.
Excellent. As I asked Tami, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, after you.
As I asked Tami, what entry points might you give an aspiring poet regarding the selection of words?
I think you have to quite early on decide what voice you want to use and who you are speaking to. I think the question of audience is very important in how you use words and how you use the register of your poetry and other facets that you need to use. It's particularly difficult in my country because there are 11 official languages and there are very few people who are adept in more than a handful of them. So to write nationally becomes quite a difficult project for anybody to achieve. But I do think the question of choice of words has to do with audience very, very strong. What effect you're trying to promote in your audience as well. Okay, what I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about what I'm trying to do in this particular poem. I'm going to look very closely at one of the poems that you have, and I'm only going to look at the first 2 sections of that poem in this presentation because I am worried about time. It is quite strange for me because at the moment I'm getting emails from students I don't know saying, we have an essay question on this poem of yours. What did you mean in the poem? My answer is, well, what I mean is only part of the question. What do you think is going on in the poem? But here I'm breaking my own kind of rules and I'm talking about what I intend with my word choice, with my diction in a particular poem. And in order to do that, I think the first thing I have to say is that my choices here have something to do with my attempt to politicize my poetry that has gone throughout my life, but increasingly to work by inference and through mundane details rather than through direct statement about society and politics. Also, an increasing interest in mine is the socializing of landscape poetry, to show that what the details, the people that are involved in this landscape. And this question of land and landscape in South Africa is huge because, as some of you might know, the colonialism of South Africa involved huge and continuous and burgeoning land dispossession of indigenous people via colonialism and via a number of other internal things that were going on, particularly in the late 18th century. But the fact is that the Native Land Act, quote unquote, of 1913 in South Africa reserved 87% of the land for white people only, and exacerbated black people's removal from the land. Since 1994, there have been attempts at land reform, but they have had very limited success, partly through corruption, lack of skills training, elite capture, and lack of support for farmers, as well as white farmers diversifying from crop production into other forms, like game farms and so on. At the moment, a new land expropriation bill is in the offing, but really what we need to know is simply that the land is enormous symbolic value and weight in South Africa. And formally in this poem, I found throughout my career that my chief strength is in the imagistic lyric, but I've always been uncomfortable with this and have tried to find ways to broaden this. And part of what I try and do is to mix other genres in my poetry, other tones, other forms of address within the same poem. A form of what the poet Douglas Oliver would call, I guess, magpie aesthetics. And what I'm going to do here is look at the way in which I try and tilt an audience, mainly by implied meaning, which my choice of words, to get them to be receptive for the later parts of the poem, which you will have but are out of sight in what I'm doing here. Okay, let me try and get to the poem now. I got the window. Can you see it? Can you see the poem?
No, not yet.
Okay, just hang on a second. Put the window, no shade. Okay, now have you got it?
No. Now it's coming.
Ah, good, okay. I'll read it quickly first and then we'll carry on. The first two sections of Farm. The robin by the drainage line is more timid than as usual. Its wisping song dissembles, scuttles unseen through tangles of desiccated grass and under aloes, till we're hoodwinked. But the chats make up for it. Appearing one by one through a chink in a barn's rotten wall, they swivel heads, always so careful of the world, then transform to a sudden, swift succession, flick wings one by one, once settled on a stranded wire. There's a growing line of them, 8, 9, 10. Oatmeal bubbles, a whiff of dacha. Don't worry, your Ozet's hunger will be seasoned palpably with salt and butter. The empty stomach of the earth feeding through its creatures slowly appears despite the stubbornness, floats into your own to settle there. But the farm's of little use these days. Sows its own image onto websites to supplicate the stream of tourists. There is no heft left in my arm to test the blunt axe rusting on its stump. Under the rafters, spiders have hung out their transparent washing. Grudging heat claims us not. Though a meager sun awakens, leans falteringly against the day, it's hard to know this morning why, not how, its one light can be seen above the mountains. Because the slow, trembling diffusion down is just a tentative colour, a beginning to a sentence that none of us imagine can ever be completed. And I can no longer credit here what belief is mine. Immensities of cloud don't dilute bread. I sit beneath these bartered, time-shared eaves, where biltong swings, bracketed by marbles of fat, dangles and flirts with its suit of flies. Or, turning the other way, find the land undulating away to bring to sight as evident copses, cows, but also the makeshift houses, where poverty is shy enough to seem, almost to shrug itself into acceptance. To go back to the beginning, the two things I meant to explain before I started is dacha is Afrikaans marijuana, and biltong is a form of, I guess, what you would call beef jerky. Now, what I'm going to try and do in this poem is work through it, showing how it functions, or its semantic clusters, its words, its images, its choices function as prolepsis. They set up certain themes and moods that will become more and more important in the rest of the poem, after this section, which is more about direct statement and abstract conceptualization. Now, the poem is focalized through a first-person narrator who is clearly urbanized and a visitor to the farm. In fact, he's probably a tourist, but does seem to have some degree of skill in identifying at least birds. So to begin with the birds that you have in this first stanza, it works most obviously in a denotative sense. Characteristic behavior of one of our robins, the Cape robin, is that it scuttles along the ground. Another of our birds, the familiar chat, has a tendency to flick its wings on landing. However, I've tried to choose verbs which act connotatively as well, which imply other meanings in the poem. Straight away, words like dissembled and hoodwinked show that immediate impressions can't be trusted, while wisping song conjures up the possibility that attempts to utter plainly, speak one's own mind, are tentative and sometimes difficult to articulate and hear in this environment. The robin's timidity further amplifies this. An opposition is set up in the poem, which is increased in what I'll talk about later, in between what is hidden and what can be seen. And even the chats, which are more obvious to see, are, when they emerge into full view, are still so careful of the world. The chats also react in such a way that they move from one chat to a number of chats, and I'll come back to that later. So in the natural images in this poem, this double weight of the denotative and connotative continues, often more than one meaning is possible. You'll see this again in quite a little thing about spiders, that I tend to talk about the spider's web first and foremost as washing, which again is at odds with the fact that the home of the spider is a form of menace and entrapment. Moreover, the theme of the usage of the land is presented. As I've said, it's a very important debate in my country at the moment. It can be seen in one of the few statements of direct intent early on in the poem. Farm, we are told, is of little use these days. And farm now seems to get its revenue mainly from tourists. Sorry, let me just find it. The farm is of little use these days. Ironically, it's sewing its image onto websites in order to attract tourists. It's become a place of pleasure, a place to eat and smoke marijuana. Even the nature of the hunger of tourists is that, which will be contrasted later in the poem with the real hunger that exists out of sight on this farm. So you have here a kind of movement already that I'm trying to start between greed and poverty, hunger, various kinds of hunger. And you can see it even more strongly later on in the poem, where I talk about the biltong, so let me just find the biltong. Sorry, might take me a second. I'll get it somewhere. I know it's in there. Yeah, the biltong is described not through the meat, but through the marbles of fat. And the fact that the flies are described as suitors is very important. And will point to, I think, certainly to a leadership in my country, to the ongoing corruption and systems of patronage, which are endemic to our political system, which attracts criminals, fraudsters, and others who want to get onto the bandwagon. Again, I'm using natural images to try and invoke these possibilities that become apparent later in the poem. So there's an opposition at work between the old, which is heading towards a state of dissolution and decay. For example, even the barn is rotting. And something else which is emerging in terms of this, in the second section, in terms of the descriptions of light, heat, and darkness that I've got there. You'll notice this, by the second section, I've moved to the description of light, mist, warmth, and the opposition between mist and the rising sun. The mist is stubborn, the heat is grudging, the light of the sun is meager, trembling, wan, and tentative. All these word choices are quite important for me. What they're pointing to, again, implicitly, is a obscuring of the details of the poem, first of all on a literal sense, but also metaphorically, hinting at the way in which the social relations of the situation that are dealt with later in the poem are obscured. You could also say, perhaps, that the mist is the mist of the past, of the old ways of land possession and tenure, where the new is struggling to achieve sight, to be lit up, to be born. I didn't realize when I wrote the poem, but when I looked at it analytically now, I thought of the theorist Danowski's term, morbid symptoms. The new is dying, the old is dying, but the new is struggling to be born. All these choices of words, I think, are really to nudge readers towards a certain kind of receptivity in these first two sections, and prepare them for the more direct statements which will follow after the extract you have in front of you. I'm trying to instill a similar state of uncertainty, of a requirement to rethink the issue at hand in those who read the poem. The vehicle by which this mood is driven is obviously the characterization and perceptions of the first-person narrator, who is the principal voice of the poem. This narrator is uncertain of both their own capability and their own culpability. They note, for example, that there is no heft left in my arm. And all the words describing their thought and behavior are rife with doubt and uncertainty, including self-doubt. There's something of a change, I think, that occurs in the register in section 2. The language starts to move away from the mainly imagistic to more direct statement, although they're not as strong as in sections 3 and 4 of the poem, and particularly more direct statement of the narrator's thought processes and how these relate to wider social experiences. Here, the narrator's self-reflections become more obvious, as does their indecisiveness. The narrator hesitates, in fact, whether to ask how and why questions, whether to ask which one, how or why. The uncertainty whether the questions will ever be answered to anyone's or everyone's satisfaction, and the dread that the narrator admits to in this section. It even occurs in the word credit, a word that is imbued, I think, with commercial undertones. If belief becomes simply a form of commerce, as it seems to be doing in this poem in terms of the land, then how does this relate to usage, and how does this relate to people who require the land for usage in order to survive? It's only at the end of this section, right at the end of the two sections I have given you, that an important constituent comes into play. It's very important later in the poem, as you'll see when you read it. Not owners, not tourists, but the people who live in poverty in makeshift houses on the farm. The theme of what's hidden versus what's seen raises its head again in a more direct statement. This sight of poverty is evidence of displacement and dispossession. What is crucial in the last stanza is that the word almost mitigates the seeming acquiescence of the marginalized and forgotten dwellers on the farm. This is an issue which will be addressed at much greater length than the rest of the poem, where attempts will be made to turn these people into subjects rather than objects. Now, I was going to talk a little bit about the difference between the first person, singular, and plural, but I'll leave that. I don't think that's a major issue quite yet in the poem. And I just really would like to sum up by saying that in terms of the diction of this poem, all in all, my word choices, especially as regards the verbs and their qualifiers, tend to jar. They're deliberately jarring. There's a sense of underlying, unexpressed violence bubbling to the surface, just like it often does with the opening. A potential struggle, which includes the narrative's struggle with meaning and implication. I try to achieve a continual mood of displacement, of dis-ease, of disease, a removal of comfort, which I think hope will affect the reader of the poem and the way they look at the issue that I'm dealing with, and prepare them for the other sections where the people in makeshift houses, the objects, become speaking subjects with experiences, which happens later in the poem. Okay, I think that's pretty much all I want to say. It's a good thing. Okay, I hope I didn't run over time.
No, you were doing just fine. And as you were speaking, I was reminded of how much of the South African literary landscape really is a representation of its political landscape. Having read a fair amount of South African writers, it's hard to escape the physicality of existence, regardless of color lines or class lines or whatever you want to divide people up by. And so the fact that something as simple as a farm continues to represent the tensions, I think is, again, a remarkable artistic accomplishment. So, because it's not all about South Africa or Montana or wherever we happen to be, we're going to take in our last presenter for today. Mark Danowski is editor-in-chief of One Art, a journal of poetry, and senior editor for Schuylkill Valley Journal. He's the author of the poetry collection As Falls Trees from Night Ballet Press. His work has appeared in Birdwatcher's Digest, Cleaver Magazine, Gargoyle, The Healing Muse, and elsewhere. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Stan. Appreciate it. It's good to be here, and thanks to our impressive tech crew, and also lovely to be here with Tami and Kelwyn.
Excellent. As a writer and editor, Mark, what are some of the characteristics of words that you look for?
So yeah, that's why we're here, right? Diction is definitely invaluable in poetry. I'm going to start out, this is probably just a little bit fragmented, and then I'm going to read a couple poems that I think exemplify, just by use of, a couple strategic words in the poems, how much of a difference a good word choice can make. So I'd say just generally, the way that, our diction intersects with concision, the importance of razoring away the words that we don't need, an individual's personal cadence. So just, given our particular dialects, the words that we use reveal just a great deal about us and our backgrounds, and how we move through the world. You can definitely read more about this if you haven't already in Richard Hugo's quite famous The Triggering Town. He talks about creating your personal universe and, how we sort of like have ownership of certain words that are in our language, and that we should really weigh heavily on those words in our poetics. So yeah, it's important to sort of stick to the words that make sense for you to personalize your writing. I definitely like poems in general that have a sort of democratic feel to them, so they're not using a lot of high-flowing words, but, of course, everybody breaks their own rules. Stephen King writes a ton in his On Writing book about not using adverbs. And then, of course, uses adverbs all over the place, things like that. So I was just going to start off, and I was going to do one of my own poems that really just, makes a point about how we use words. So this is 14-year-old with two friends on bikes outside the Wawa on Germantown Ave. I'm nonplussed, he says, and I turn my head, stopped at the light on my way to Brewer's Outlet. The light turns, and so I only catch their faces, not laughs. That must have followed. It still happens once in a while. You pick up a word and wield it triumphantly. So nonplussed, is kind of funny, just out of place. And I think we all remember those periods where you learn a new word and then you play with it a bunch. And then these are just a couple poems from other writers that I think, you'll sort of feel the word that sticks out that really makes the poem. So this is Jennifer Michael Hecht's poem on the strength of all conviction and the stamina of love. Sometimes I think we could have gone on, all of us trying forever. But they didn't fill the desert with pyramids. They just built some. They're not still out there building them now. Everyone, everywhere, gets up and goes home. Yet we must not diabolize time, right? We must not curse the passage of time. So the word there, of course, diabolize is kind of an archaic word. It's a little unusual and it jumps out at you. And I think just because she has one word in there that really sticks out, that you kind of get away with it, and it really works as a takeaway. Just overall, I feel it's a brilliant poem. But using a long title, that's another clever trick of the poem. The pacing, the breath, her particular cadence. It's a chopped sonnet. In any case, it's one example. Another kind of classic is Lorraine Nidecker's Poet's Work, which is a very short poem. Grandfather advised me, learn a trade. I learned to sit at desk and condense. No layoff from this condensery. So condensery sticks out in this case, kind of like diabolizing the Hecht poem. And I feel like it's not she's not just being clever, it's kind of poetry clever. And, since she's talking about the importance of the dedication to all of our art form, poetry. And I mean, it's a fun poem to sit with and read into. And then one more poem that I was going to talk about, again, just sort of similar concept. This is Coffee Break by Kwame Dawes. It was Christmas time, the balloons needed blowing, and so in the evening, we sat together to blow balloons and tell jokes. And the cool air off the hills made me think of coffee. So I said, coffee would be nice. And he said, yes, coffee would be nice, and smiled as his thin fingers pulled the balloons from their plastic bags. So I went for coffee, and it takes a few minutes to make coffee. And I did not know if he wanted cow's milk or condensed milk. And when I came out to ask him, he was gone, just like that. In the time it took me to think cow's milk or condensed, the balloon sat lightly on his still lap. And, I think the poem obviously has a real unforgettable takeaway, but just that single image there of cow's milk or condensed milk, which also really, places the poem. It's the same as, sort of talking about Hugo's personal universe. Not everybody would think to use condensed milk depending on your particular background and how you came up in the world. And so that, that's another aspect in which the particular makes the poem more universal, which is a common lesson that I think we all think we realize, and it takes us a while to kind of get that concept. We think it's sort of, making a poem more vague and using a lot of platitudes and just open-ended language would actually have more inroads. But instead, the opposite is true, that, if you write a poem and, talk about the particular reason, like you had a surgery, like if you said, like it was a heart surgery, then, there's someone that had a correlated kind of experience. Like they had like, oh, well, I had, like whatever, this kind of surgery. They can relate better than if you just leave it really open-ended and say like, well, I went into the ER. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Excellent, Mark. For those of you that want to send in questions, be sure that you do that now. I like what you had to say about each of us has our own vocabulary, and I really appreciated the nonplussed poem, because we all have those words that we come across and we say, oh, I love that word, I want to use that word, but if we don't use it, we lose it. I don't know how many words I have learned, but obviously lost because I never had a chance to use them again. So for each poet, I think it would be interesting to, particularly a poet who has passed, we have their complete work, to do a linguistic analysis and see what words was their vocabulary made of. Because I'm sure that it would differ, quite widely. I'm thinking, I don't think I've used biltong in a poem, though, I easily could because I like biltong. So sometimes we get, we have to be reminded that our vocabularies really are bigger than what we actually use. We understand a lot more words than we speak. And I think for the poet, part of our toolbox is learning to reduce that distance between our speaking vocabulary and our writing vocabulary. Because, as all of you have said in various ways, we choose words for a variety of purposes, whether it be, political implication or the echo of sound or that sense of discovery. We're always thinking in terms of getting the right word. And there's no rubric that tells us what right means. Right is that poetic choice that we have to make that says, so in this context, I have a word that might suggest this other meaning, or I have a word that echoes the sound of a word later in the poem, or I have a word that that gives a second layer, a double meaning to what is there. And I think all of those are important. And before we go to questions, I just wonder if any of the panelists, just want to say something a little further about the poet's vocabulary and how we use that.
I would just say that I think it's interesting to think about this. I find that words sometimes float up, not words that I would have used probably in speaking. Semblance is a word that floated into the poem unexpectedly, but turned out to be, a good choice. I think, like so many other things, we loving words and investigating words and pursuing words just builds that sort of interior well that we can draw from. Without that, without reading, without looking things up and pursuing, our vocabularies may be quite small, and that limits us.
I think it's quite an interesting question in South Africa. In terms of my own work, I think the register of language I use sometimes has limited or changed my choice of words. Somebody interviewing me once said that my poetry seemed to change register from the time before I was an academic, which was my first book, and after I became an academic. And I think that's partly true. My language tended to get more formal, and when it was more casual, more conversationalist, it was sometimes a little bit self-conscious. So I think there is a difference, but I think also your choice of words and your registers also they relate to being in a country where there are a number of languages at play all the time. For example, Afrikaans, I had to learn Afrikaans in apartheid South Africa, so I'm bilingual. I have little traces of things, Setswana, Zulu, other languages. But I've noticed that sometimes it's a kind of Afrikaans mode of expression that comes into my poetry. But the interesting thing is that I've also seen this in the work of some Black poets who I've studied or known. The Black consciousness writer Mafika Bwala, for example, in one of his poems, when he's castigating people who aren't taking on the Black experience, he says, you, non-whites, you. Now that's registers Afrikaans, yay, whatever word you want to use, yay, is straight Afrikaans. And he's transposed it into a Black consciousness poetry in a township setting. So I think that's the interesting thing about register. When there are a number floating around, I think the best thing you do is try and become aware of them, but also stay quite careful about what you think you can use and what you know you can't use. You know what I mean? It has to be to some extent familiar to your everyday usage.
I agree with that. And again, as you were talking, I'm thinking about what a rich linguistic heritage you have in South Africa. That it might be mirrored somewhat in the United States, where the rest of us are in this panel. I'm thinking, there are Hispanic influences. There are, the Black Lives Matter, speech patterns that may influence the way we speak. And as you say, it all comes together, but it all doesn't mix. And so I think it is important that we think about which words are ours personally as a poet, in times where that matters, where we're not taking on the persona of someone that comes from a different cultural background. What other thoughts might you have? Brittany says we have no questions from our listeners at this point. So we as panelists are free to talk for a few minutes if you like. Do you have something to say, Mark?
Yeah, I just thought I'd note it sounds like we're all sort of dancing around what can kind of be summed up as saying like people have to stay in their lane a little bit when it comes to language. So I just thought I'd add that's like that is kind of important. Like you do have to know like what's reasonable vocabulary. I was raised with like a background that's like very NPR English, and so like I speak NPR English, and I probably shouldn't deviate too much from that in my poetry. And just as a fun one, because I think people might have thoughts and will definitely disagree in many ways, is I personally just tend to love the language that poets come out with in their first drafts. Especially just like if I love someone's style, I'm like in love with the first draft. And then I feel like they, put on their editor's hat and they sort of take away a lot of just like a lot of that original essence. And, you know, most people will tell you that an important part of being a good poet is to like revise. And that's usually the right answer. But if others would like to weigh in about, you know, the value of the first draft.
I think what has struck me about my drafts, and I go through many drafts, I mean, it's been the one way, even though I'm computer illiterate, I've loved how the computer has allowed me to play with, not only with the words, but with space on page, and being able to see what you can do with poem shape and space. But having said that, I guess I'd go back to the very first thing that one learns as a beginner poet, is the problem with first drafts for me is they do capture, I think, sound quite well in my own. I kind of get the sound right quite early on. But I will look at a draft even weeks, months later and say, no, that word's inexact. And it's that old problem you get when you start out already, where you know what you mean, but that word you got on the page doesn't really signify, I guess, the nuances of what you're trying to say. And that's my worry about first drafts. I love the computer because it allows me to go through draft after draft after draft.
Thank you, Kelwyn. That's a refreshing response, partly because sometimes we forget that people of a certain age, and I will include myself in that, didn't grow up with computers. You know, a lot of poets today, you know, that's second nature. You know, and I'm always surprised when I find young people who still write by hand. I think it's refreshing. I think there's value in that, but it doesn't, as you say, help you visualize the look on the page in the same way. So I think that's important. We did get a question that came in, and it's directed back toward Mark. But I think any of you can answer this. But you talked about words and phrases that stick out, that stand out one way in a poem. And the question is, what effect can it have, and how do you use it effectively? I guess part of that question, if I'm to paraphrase it, is how do you misuse that word that stands out?
That's an excellent question, and off the cuff, I'm unsure how to give you a terrific answer to that. Would anyone else like to take a stab at it?
Say it again, Stan. What are we looking?
Well, the question was regarding the use of words and phrases that stick out. What effect can it have, and how to use it effectively? And I think implicit in that is the question: how do I use it ineffectively? You know, yeah.
To me, that it seems like a point of experimentation. You know, how wild can you get on the page and see what happens, and try again and again and again. I mean, I don't know that there would be Mark could probably, if anybody here, answer that question in terms of, is there a formula for this? But I think there isn't. I think you know, like so much of poetry, you know, you play around. I mean, in fact, that's the spirit I think we have to bring to poetry when we're learning poetry is, you know, you are free to goof off and try all kinds of things and see what happens. There's nothing to lose, really. You just keep trying and trying. That's how we grow. That and reading other poets. Mark's mentioned Richard Hugo, who happened to be my first teacher, actually. And he he used to say, maybe this is helpful. He used to say, he was big really on the poetic turn, though he didn't talk about it that way. He said, you're going after this certain, you're working with this material, throw an alligator in. So do something maybe unexpected and see where that leads you. Because like conversation, if we just sort of have this deadly pursuit of a particular single theme, it gets boring. So maybe that's one way to think about it.
I'm afraid I can only answer this frivolously. It became a joke between me and my friends that I would allow myself one difficult word per poem. And for many years, this is what happened. And the problem is one of the poems that I've sent to you, it does precisely this, but I'm not trying to do it anymore. And it's the word mucilaginous in One Breath Away poem. Now, one of my ex-students who knows my work quite well said, I just had to read that first line and I knew it was you. And I've tried everything to get rid of that word. I can't find a simpler word that kind of suits my purpose or suits the sound I'm trying to get. So I just kind of shrug my shoulders past the point and say, well, if it's there, it's there.
Okay, any other thoughts? Well, this has gotten us all thinking as well as talking about the words we use. And I'm sure all of us will be a little bit self-conscious for the next couple of days as we're writing about, okay, what did I say about this, or what did I hear about this? But that's not a bad thing. A little purposefulness in our usage, I think, reprimes us to be a better writer. And so I want to thank Tami and Kelwyn and Mark for bringing their expertise to today's panel, and for all the wisdom that they've shared, as well as the poetry and the interaction that we've had. And so for Diction and Poetry, the Pier-Glass Poetry panels will sign off for today. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.